This week's big media story is stark. A sitting US president says he's going to sue the BBC for somewhere between $1 and $5 billion over a 12-second edit in a Panorama documentary. The controversy comes from the 2024 Panorama film Trump: A Second Chance, which spliced together two parts of Trump's 6th of January 2021 speech almost an hour apart. In reality, Trump first said, "We are going to walk down to the Capitol," and much later, separately, we fight like hell." In the programme, these lines were cut together and overlaid with images of the mob heading towards the Capitol, creating the impression of a single continuous call to march and fight. After an internal memo by Michael Prescott was leaked, the BBC eventually admitted that this was an error of judgment and that the edit wrongly suggested a direct call for violent action. The Director General Tim Davie and the Head of News Deborah Turnus both resigned. Trump's lawyers then demanded a full retraction, a grovelling apology, and at least $1 billion in damages. The BBC apologised, promised never to rebroadcast the programme in that form, but refused compensation and rejected any suggestion of defamation. Trump has now said on Air Force One and in interviews with GB News that he will go ahead and sue for anywhere between $1 and $5 billion, probably in Florida. That is the factual background. The real questions are, does he have a serious legal case? What does this do to the BBC, and what sort of precedent does it set? Trump is threatening a defamation suit. In US law, that means he must show four things. A false statement of fact was made about him, this was published to others, it damaged his reputation, and because he's a public figure, that it was made with actual malice, knowledge of falsity, or reckless disregard for the truth. The actual malice hurdle is quite complex. Here, in narrow terms, Trump's lawyers have actually something to work with. The BBC didn't merely summarise him in an unflattering way. They rearranged his words so that phrases spoken 50 minutes apart appeared as one continuous exhortation, and then cut to images that made it look as though the crowd was responding directly to that call. The corporation has admitted the edit gave a misleading impression of a direct call to violent action, and in fact, the BBC did it twice. The US Supreme Court precedent of the Mason versus New Yorker line of cases treats knowingly false quotations as particularly serious. If you change the meaning of what someone said by putting words together that were not in fact spoken in that way, courts can treat that as evidence of actual malice. So, on this point, Trump's lawyers can say, you didn't just criticise him, you manufactured a pseudo-quotation which you now acknowledge was misleading. You had ample time to check the transcript and you didn't correct it until you were caught. Legally, that is not frivolous. The jurisdiction, the Florida problem, is a bigger problem. Where Trump's case becomes much weaker is where he wants to sue. The Panorama film was broadcast in the UK, available on iPlayer only for UK users. The BBC insists it didn't distribute the programme on its US platforms. To sue in Florida, Trump must show that the BBC has minimal contacts with that state in relation to this specific programme. His lawyers will say, in effect, you cannot build a digital wall. In the modern media environment, material put out in London is inevitably watched and shared in Miami. The BBC will respond, we did everything reasonable to confine this particular documentary to the UK, so it's unfair to drag us before a Florida jury for a UK broadcast. If a US court accepts Trump's theory, it would push things towards a kind of unofficial universal jurisdiction over the world's broadcasters. Anything said anywhere about an American politician could end up being litigation in a US court because someone in Florida watched a clip on their phone. That is precisely the outcome many US First Amendment scholars are wary of. As for damages, has he actually suffered any loss? Even if Trump clears the two other hurdles, he must still show serious damage. And here, his own political success cuts against him. The Panorama programme ran before the 2024 election. He went on to win. In strict legal terms, it's quite difficult to argue that a UK-only documentary caused catastrophic financial or reputational harm to a man who is now president for the second time. Some US lawyers have floated the idea of Trump as near libel proof as an libel-proof defendant, his reputation for good or ill is already baked in. It is hard to show that this 12-second clip meaningfully altered public views at all. That is why one leading constitutional lawyer put Trump's chance of ultimate success at very slim. Not zero, but decidedly not strong. In short, he may have a plausible grievance, but not a serious chance. Is a weak lawsuit. So why bring the case anyway? If the odds of legal victory are modest, the politics are much more attractive for Trump. There are several advantages that are obvious. This provides narrative fuel for the fake news story. This episode allows him to say, I called for peaceful protest. They literally cut my words to make me look like an insurrectionist. They have admitted it. They were the ones lying. It gives concrete footage to a long-running narrative about hostile liberal media. The BBC is, of course, terrified of a Florida jury handing down a vast damages award it cannot pay. Even if the case is weak on the law, the risk is existential. That gives Trump bargaining power to extract concessions, apologies, or inform reforms of coverage. Trump has recently obtained a $16 million settlement from Paramount over a dispute involving a Kamala Harris interview. That case was not exactly parallel, but it shows that very large US media groups will sometimes pay substantial sums simply to make litigation and regulatory troubles go away. Suing the BBC is part of the same pattern. A message to editors that aggressive coverage of him may be financially dangerous. The case plugs directly into an existing right-wing criticism of the BBC as institutionally biased, particularly on Trump, Israel, and gender. The Prescott memo on editorial bias and the subsequent resignations have already shaken confidence. For UK critics who want to shrink or radically reform the BBC, Trump's threatened lawsuit is a gift. Even the US president says they distorted the record. So, even if the case loses, it can still succeed as theatre, as pressure, as another brick in the wall of the BBC is corrupt, so we need to cut it down to size. What this does for the BBC, this crisis lands on several levels. First, the straightforward one about editorial credibility. They did something they absolutely should not do. You do not take two parts of a speech nearly an hour apart, glue them together so they sound continuous, and then overlay footage that reinforces a narrative you know is contested. Having had to admit that this created a mistaken impression of a direct call to violent action, they have handed Trump and his allies the earliest possible charge: you cooked the evidence. The forced departure of Davey and Turnus is not just about one clip. It's the visible symbol of a broader set of accusations: bias on the Middle East, on trans issues, on Brexit, on Trump himself. These were already raw nerves. The Panorama scandal crystallized them. That leaves the incoming leadership with a near impossible task: to defend the core of the BBC while acknowledging that some output has fallen below its own standards. And this also lands at a moment when the licence fee and the very scale of the BBC are under review. Ministers such as Lisa Nandy can simultaneously affirm the importance of a strong, impartial BBC and insist that things must improve. The two things at the same time. The Trump suit intensifies an existing debate. Should licence fee payers' money be used to fight or even settle a multi-billion-pound claim in a Florida court? Or would paying anything at all be an unacceptable use of public funds, rewarding lawfare and inviting copycat suits? Of course, the same question could be asked of the NHS. Should taxpayers' money be used to fight legal cases? Either way, the row strengthens voices calling for a smaller, more tightly focused BBC and perhaps a different funding model. Does this chill the press or does it correct the press? That's another question which I suppose one ought to ask. There are two competing worries here, and both have some force. On the one side, press freedom groups warn of a chilling effect. If If you're an editor and you know that a single misjudged edit can trigger a 9-figure lawsuit from the President of the United States, you may shy away from critical or investigative work on powerful people. You might kill or soften stories not because they are false, but because you fear being dragged into endless litigation. This is especially sharp when the plaintiff is head of state, backed by the resources and regulatory power of government, and when previous suits have already produced big settlements. Trump doesn't need to have a win to have influenced that decision decisively. On the other side, there is a legitimate need for remedies when broadcasters genuinely falsify the record. Defamation law exists so that powerful institutions cannot simply put invented words into someone's mouth and shrug it off as editing. What makes this case so uncomfortable is that both are true. The BBC did something it should never have done. A serious public broadcaster must not compress and reassemble a speech in a way that alters its meaning on a question as serious as insurrection, at the same time allowing the US courts to become global libel tribunals or anything said anywhere about an American politician would be disastrous for free expression. The responsible answer is not never sue the media, nor sue them into oblivion, but a tighter focus on proportional remedies, clear, prominent corrections, on-air explanations, internal discipline, and in extreme cases, modest damages that reflect demonstrable harm, not fantasy sums designed for intimidation. In that sense, the BBC's public apology and the resignations probably were, from a legal and ethical point of view, the right first steps. Whether Trump chooses to push on to trial will tell us whether this is about vindication or about spectacle. So what might actually happen next? Well, legally, there are 4 possible outcomes. The first is the case is filed in Florida and thrown out on jurisdictional grounds. The court rules that a UK-only broadcast with no authorised US distribution doesn't create sufficient connection with Florida. 2. The case proceeds, but Trump wins little or nothing. A judge might accept that the edit was misleading, but find minimal damages and emphasise the strong First Amendment protection for political speech, especially when the plaintiff has since prospered. 3. A negotiated settlement. This is Trump's favourite terrain. Even a relatively small sum, plus some face-saving language about BBC standards, would allow him to claim victory. The BBC, however, knows that paying out would inflame UK politics and licence fee anger. And 4, the nightmare scenario for the BBC, an angry Florida judge and jury and a huge award. This is unlikely in strict legal terms, but it is the risk that haunts the new broadcasting house, because one runaway verdict could financially cripple the corporation. Most US legal analysts currently put the overall chance of Trump securing a decisive courtroom win as low, but the politics, the symbolism, and the pressure are very real. So, how should we read Trump's threatened $5 billion lawsuit, not simply as a tantrum, but simply as a noble crusade against media lies, and a calculated play that sits at the intersection of 3 things: a genuine BBC editorial failure, a long-running cultural war over the broadcaster's bias and future, and a president who has learned that law can be used as a political weapon to win or lose. For the BBC, the answer cannot be to retreat into timidity. It has to be braver and more accurate at the same time. Stop the clever edit, stop the narrative splicing, stick to what it's historically done best: long, patient, factual reporting that leaves the audience to judge. For Trump, even an unsuccessful case will serve his story that he is the victim of a permanent media establishment which, this time, really did misrepresent him. And for the rest of us, the lesson is that trust in public broadcasters is fragile. When they cut corners, they do not just give ammunition to their enemies, they imperil the wider principle that we need strong, independent journalism more than ever. Not journalism that is above criticism, but journalism that does not have to fear the next Florida jury every time an edit decision is made. I think this could be a turning point for the BBC, and it's not impossible that Trump could claim some sort of victory at almost any reading of this story. It is also possible that Trump could be left with a certain amount of egg on his face. But the sorry and sad reality is that the BBC has failed once and almost certainly twice. It has admitted 2 failings. There's not a lot of wriggle room except on technicalities, is there?